little bit harder to get rid of the discrimination, and that's what we're going to start talking about today. The civil rights movement was not just about ending segregation, it was also about trying to end discrimination. Discrimination is something that's a little deeper, it's inside, and it takes a little bit more effort to get rid of. Here are two names and two stories that are part of the civil rights movement. Emmett Till and Rosa Parks. Who can tell me the story of Emmett Till, first of all? If not from your book, maybe you know the story. The story that you told was of the young man who was actually visiting relatives, I believe, from Chicago. He was visiting relatives in Mississippi and talked about having a white girlfriend. And of course, friends didn't believe him because in Mississippi that sort of thing just didn't happen. And so he spoke to a white woman. Speaking to a white woman, initiating a conversation with a white person was really something that blacks in Mississippi just simply didn't do, did they? And so initiating this conversation with a white woman, she found very offensive. She went home and told her husband, and the young man then was killed. He even confessed later to the murder, but an all-white jury found him innocent. The outrage was felt not just in Chicago, where this young man was from, but really all around the country. And what made that so? What made it possible for people all over the country now to see this case, to hear this case, and to be outraged by it? TV, right. Television played an important role here. Victor?
Oh, you mean the white guy confesses to the murder and they let him go?
There was no doubt in the minds of anyone probably in the country, but it had been very typically the case that if these cases even came to trial, which they usually didn't, that an all-white jury would not find a person guilty for killing a black person. Not in
it's like that dragging murder a while back in Texas.
Similar. The reaction was similar too. Great outrage. Outrage not only among the black community, but in the North and in other parts of the country. In Mississippi, they sort of expected this. This was sort of the norm. But outside of Mississippi, in many parts of the country, people were outraged. And many whites were outraged too, that a person could be so blatantly guilty and be found innocent. Tell me the story of Rosa Parks. What's her background? What organization was she a member of?
NAACP.
Yeah, she was a member of the NAACP. Good. And she had previously, before this particular incident, she had been arrested before for incidents on the bus, refusing to get up or move to the back of the bus. And on this day, she decided it was a good day to try again. The NAACP, of course, was always looking for legal action, always looking for ways that they could fight against discrimination. And as a member of that, I think she was looking perhaps for legal action again. She refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. She was arrested, and her arrest then brought about a boycott of the bus line in Montgomery. The Montgomery bus boycott began with this incident. How successful was that bus boycott? How long did it last? Almost a year, right. And it was very successful. Most blacks did stay off the buses, and that was quite a sacrifice. Why?
Well, the bus was how they got around.
For a lot of them, it was their only way to get to work, wasn't it? Taxis, of course, are expensive. Yeah. A lot of them joined together and carpooled. A lot of them walked if they could. There were certain churches that got their own buses and took people around and tried to get them to work and so forth. But it was a real hardship for the black community because they, for the most part, had not been able to afford their own transportation and had relied on the bus line, which, by the way, was owned mostly by white businessmen, wasn't it? What happened to the organizers of the bus boycott?
They were arrested, right?
They were arrested and put in jail. That's right. Okay. How was it settled, by the way? It was settled when the bus company finally gave in and said, we're going to let them sit wherever they want because the bus line had lost so much money. And this came even before the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was illegal. Now, the ruling against segregation on buses did not apply to city buses. Why? Why can the federal government, in this case the federal government,
Was it the Interstate Commerce Commission?
the Interstate Commerce Commission regulates trade
Across the state lines, right?
across state lines. So initially it only affected buses that went across state lines, and then later they found other ways, and there are always ways, other ways to get at those buses in the cities. They could say things like, well, the bus was manufactured outside of the state, brought into the state, therefore it can be controlled by interstate commerce. Or they use gasoline that's made outside of the state or refined outside of the state and shipped in. Therefore, if that gasoline is made outside of the state, then it falls under our jurisdiction. They found ways of doing it. 1957, as we move forward here a little bit, 1957 was the Little Rock, Arkansas school situation. What was that situation in Little Rock?
The first integration of a high school.
Central High School was going to be integrated to a very small degree, by the way. Only 9 black students were going to be sent to an all-white school. That was the first step in integration in Little Rock. They had a plan that was a multi-year plan to integrate their school, and it was going to start with these 9 students.
Didn't President Truman intervene?
No, it was Eisenhower. Yeah, the governor refused. He said, we will not allow this in Arkansas. He refused to such an extent that in the next year, he even did what? 1958. The Little Rock schools. He closed them down, right? He closed them down. And of course, he was found in contempt and so forth of court. But Eisenhower was in a difficult situation because Eisenhower really didn't believe that you could force people to accept integration. But on the other hand, the courts had said they had to integrate, and that was the law, and he was the president. And it's the president's job to do what? To enforce the law. So he really felt kind of in the middle. And in the end, of course, being the general that he was, the leader that he was, he decided that he had to enforce this law. He was the president, that was his job. And so he sent in troops. He did so only after several weeks into the semester. The Civil Rights Movement, of course, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King. There are really 2 parts to the Civil Rights Movement. There's this nonviolent sort of revolution that's going on. And then there's also the more violent side, which you saw in the film last week, and which we'll talk about later. Dr. Martin Luther King and James Lawson are 2 names that are at the top of the list when you are talking about the nonviolent revolution. Everyone knows, I guess, who Dr. Martin Luther King is, but who was James Lawson? What was his background? Tony?
Well, didn't he work in one of the big churches in the South? He was some kind of religious leader. I'm not exactly sure what else he did.
Well, he was a minister, just like Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a minister, but he was also a missionary. Where had he done his missionary work?
In India.
In India, right. And in India, of course, he had opportunity to learn about the nonviolent civil disobedience preached by who? Okay, by Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi, of course, if you know the story about Gandhi, Gandhi was an Indian who lived in South Africa under apartheid and developed these ideas of civil disobedience, of nonviolent revolution, and then took those ideas with him from South Africa to India and really led the struggle against the British for independence of India. And so James Lawson takes those ideas and he reads about back home the bus boycott and some of the marches and so forth that were going on, and decides to bring that nonviolent civil disobedience message back to his country to help in the civil rights struggle. And so he comes back and becomes one of the leaders in this movement. And by nonviolent revolution, we mean things like the marches, the speeches, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the boycotts, and so on. What were the freedom riders, or who were the freedom riders? Sure.
They were people, blacks and whites, that rode around the country trying to make people aware of civil rights. They were trying to teach us about civil rights.
Okay, usually blacks and whites together, people who rode on these buses across the South in integrated buses in defiance of the segregation order, trying to get their message out. Segregation was an evil thing. Also, sometimes along the way, they tried to sign up or register black voters in many places. Their message was completely nonviolent. However, from time to time, of course, they were met with violence in many of the small towns as they went across the South. Sometimes even they were dragged off the bus and beaten up and so on.
Is that like the Black Panther movement?
That was later. That was later, and that was a different organization. But that is true. So all of this is part of the nonviolent revolution. And it really is this nonviolent revolution that gets people interested, I think, more and more interested in what was going on in the South, because there was nothing at all violent about what was happening, so people couldn't feel threatened by it. And so a lot more whites, I think, in the North became sympathetic with the cause of civil rights because they saw that it was taking this nonviolent kind of approach. Your book talks about the causes of the civil rights movement. And there's a cause and effect chart in your book. Here are the 5 causes they give. Factors contributing to the civil rights movement. One of them, they say, is black urbanization. When did that black urbanization occur? When did blacks in large numbers move into the cities? Just before the civil rights movement. When would there have been a big exodus of blacks from the countryside into the cities to work, to find jobs?
60s?
Before that.
50s?
Before that. What did you say, Tony?
World War II.
Yeah, really during the war, right? When they needed lots of workers during the war and after the war, large numbers of blacks, because of their experience in the military or because they were needed in the factory, had gone to live in the cities. So you do have large black communities emerging in most northern cities. Wherever there were factories, you had large numbers of blacks. Why would living in cities make them more likely to begin this revolution for civil rights?
They're all together?
Very good, because they're all together, right? There was strength in numbers, right? And while they were dispersed across the countryside in the South, far from one another, they didn't have the power or the strength or the unity that they had once they were brought together into these large neighborhoods in the North. So black urbanization is certainly one reason. A second factor are the black churches. Most of the leaders of the civil rights movement were what? Were pastors, ministers, right? Most of them were the leaders of the church as well. And in the black churches, you had not just religion being taught, but you also had political messages being given, and word being spread from one community to another about what was going on. And so that was a way of getting the message out. More than just getting out the gospel, they were getting out the message about this whole movement of civil rights. The Supreme Court, of course, is a factor. If there hadn't been those early decisions ending segregation, movement forward probably would have been delayed. In the 1950s, the Supreme Court is going to outlaw segregation in just about every area. And in so doing, it kind of got the ball rolling. The Constitution, your book calls it the Constitution. The Constitution had always been there. The Constitution was there back in slavery days, wasn't it? But only when the Supreme Court started interpreting the Constitution in a different way did things start to make progress, did things start to go forward. And then TV. What role does TV play here? That shows what it's all about. What people